Excellent. All right. Okay, I can see our participants joining us as we speak. Welcome everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I really want to thank you for coming to this next in our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series, where you can ask an economist or a researcher all your burning questions about what exactly is happening to our economy and what happens next. So those of you who are familiar with our work, you might realize that normally we like to try and do these kinds of events in the pub, but obviously that's not possible at the moment. So we're aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times might vary. So make sure that you're subscribed at tai.org.au so you don't miss out on hearing about our next one. This week we saw the government do a very welcome backflip, announcing a wage subsidy scheme called the Job Keeper scheme. I keep confusing it with the Job Seeker or calling it the wrong thing. And the Job Keeper scheme will pay a flat rate of $1,500 a fortnight to employers to cover full-time, part-time and some casual workers. And there's no better person to explain the details of this program than our guest today, Jim Stanford, Economist and Director of the Centre for Future Work. But before we go to Jim, there's just a bit of housekeeping before we start. So Jim's going to talk to you for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to start taking questions from you. So if you want to start writing those questions now, then we can get straight into it when we get to that part. And so if you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function, a chat function, and a few other functions. So that's where you can put your questions. And we've also had a few people send in questions beforehand as well. So the Centre for Future Work was founded in 2016 at the Australia Institute, and it's become a go-to source for credible, progressive information and analysis on labour markets. And Jim himself is, as well as being the founder and the first director, is also the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which has been published in 6 different languages. So that's pretty impressive. But in short, there's really no one better than Jim to explain the details of this package and how it stacks up. So please welcome Jim Stanford. G'day, Jim.
Hi. Hi, Ebony. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for organizing this. And I should tell our audience that I'm coming to you all the way from Vancouver, Canada. That's where I happened to be when the music stopped and the planes stopped flying. So I'm going to be based on the Canadian side of the Pacific until this pandemic is over, which hopefully will not be more than a few weeks. But I'm really glad to join with you this way. So thanks again. Of course, up in Canada, we're fighting the coronavirus as well. And because it's colder in Canada, I don't know if you're aware of this, the coronavirus itself gets bigger in Canada. So they're bigger coronaviruses that we have to fight as they go by. But we're doing our best to keep it under control with social distancing and a first-class public health infrastructure. And hopefully we'll all come through this just fine. Of course, I'm following the advice of the mental health experts who say, while you're working at home, you should try to follow your own daily routine as much as possible. So that's why, I do get up, I have a shower, I put on my shirt and tie and suit and everything, especially for an occasion like this. Of course, I'm not fully hinged, so I've still got my beach shorts on there. But we'll figure that out. I'm hoping that I'll get to the beach, I guess, is what that is. So anyways, I promise no April Fool's jokes in this presentation. I think I'm getting dangerously close to that. I'm going to share a presentation now that I'll run through. It'll take just a few minutes, and then we'll go for the questions and answers from the presentation. So I've titled this presentation, Off the Cliff. What does that mean for our economy, the pandemic, and how are we going to protect jobs and incomes for all of us as we go through it? I do want to note that all of the research that we've been doing on the coronavirus and the economic and social impacts is published at our website, futurework.org.au. And there's a lot there. We've done a very nice catalog of international policy responses to the pandemic. We've analyzed the government's responses, fiscal responses, the new wage subsidy, and so on. So please check out our website and follow us, of course, on social media. You're welcome to tweet from this presentation today. Called the presentation Off the Cliff. And the reason I call it that, I know that's a bit daunting, but we really are facing something very daunting, is because of the unprecedented extreme downturn in our economy that we're heading into. And just to give you some perspective on that, this graph shows the most recent recession that Australia has experienced. As you know, we've gone about 3 decades without a formal recession. And this one shows the last recession that we had, where basically GDP was growing, the economy was growing, not terribly well. And then for a little while, it started to contract. So that circle there shows the actual recession. For about a year and a half, GDP was shrinking. It declined by about 2 or 3%. And then the recovery started, and then the economy continued to grow. For anyone in the audience who remembers, that was a very tough time. Unemployment was high. It was very hard to get a job. There was a lot of economic and social hardship from that recession. Just to keep it in perspective, what we're looking at today isn't remotely like that recession or any other recession that we've experienced. This graph shows where we're possibly headed with this pandemic and the shutdown of economic activity that's happening. Many people are expecting a decline in GDP of as much as 20% coming up in the next few weeks. And that's because so much of our economy has forcibly been shut down. We're just not able to go to work, provide the services, particularly in consumer service industries, and generate the incomes that we're used to generating. So this is where we really say it is off a cliff. There's nothing we can do to avoid this immediate downturn in production. In fact, we want that downturn to occur because we want people to stay home. The question is, what comes next? How do we protect people through this downturn? And then how do we get the economy back on its feet and heading in a normal direction as quickly as possible? I've been trying to think of fitting analogies, if you like, for the sort of recession, the sort of unprecedented downturn that we're facing right now. One of them that comes to mind could be Thelma and Louise. Okay, another one could be Wile E. Coyote. Okay, both going off the cliff. In Wile E. Coyote's case, he doesn't start falling until he looks down, but eventually he starts falling, and this is what we're up against with this downturn. This really is an unprecedented and frightening moment. Whole parts of the economy. Yes.
I just wanted to address, there's some people here who aren't getting the slides. So I just want to reassure everyone that we will send these around afterwards in case you can't see, along with a recording where you should be able to see them in that, just for anyone who's worried about missing out. Sorry, okay. Jim, keep going.
Okay, very good. I hope some people can see the slides. You can see them?
Yes, definitely. Some people can. There's a lot of people saying they can.
Okay, very good. So whole parts of the economy are shutting down. As you know, retail stores have had to close, hospitality, cafes, restaurants, arts, sports, entertainment, a lot of transportation, airlines have been affected. And then those are just the first victims, if you like. The spillover impact will then spread into other parts of the economy. For example, if a retail store closes, well, you've lost that bit of work immediately, but the retail store will then stop buying from the wholesale industry. And the wholesale industry will stop purchasing from the manufacturing sector, and so on it goes. Global supply chains have been disrupted because of what's happened with the health crisis and the limits on travel. And then there's going to be other chain reactions, as would occur in a normal recession, except much, much worse, because consumer spending will be shocked, business investment will contract or almost disappear. Our exports will be hurt, and so on. So this is an unprecedented moment. In terms of the scale of what we could be looking at, just so we understand how serious this is, I would expect within the next 6 weeks a loss of employment in Australia of 2 million or more jobs in coming weeks. And that would be enough to take the unemployment rate from 5% in the last labor force survey towards 20%. A decline in GDP of 10% or more just in the June quarter. That's the period that runs from April 1st till the end of June. We're just entering the June quarter today. There may have been a decline in the March quarter. It's hard to say because the impact of the shutdown really just hit in the last couple of weeks. But the June quarter will feel the full onslaught. immediate losses of incomes for people who've lost their job, which means they can't spend anything. So this is without doubt the worst and sharpest and fastest downturn in our economy that we have ever experienced. Worse even, no doubt, than the 1930s. So the task that we face now, how do we protect people as much as we can as we go through this? And then how do we stop it from becoming another 1930s, where an initial economic shock was mismanaged and resulted in 10 lost years, 10 years of stagnation and very high unemployment. And if we're not careful, that could happen this time as well. This graph is taken from a recent OECD report that estimated the impact of coronavirus shutdowns on all of their different member countries. And they're all on the negative side of the ledger there. Just to show you where Australia is, that's Australia. They're expecting a 22% decline in Australia's GDP over the coming 6 months. By that reckoning, Australia isn't the worst of the countries that are put there, but everybody's got a very negative drop. And the reason that Australia's is somewhat smaller than reductions in other places is because Australia's economy has a different sectoral mix than some of the others. The countries that are the hardest hit are those that depend most on services. Australia, of course, still has a very large primary sector, resources and minerals exports in particular, which they don't expect to be as affected quite as badly. But really, it's cold comfort. I'm sure that someone in the coalition government is going to stand up and look at this graph and say, this shows the confidence in the sound economic management of Australia, which is nonsense. It's just a function of the sectoral mix of Australia's economy. And ultimately, we are all in this soup together. There's no industrial country in the world that's going to escape a very major and painful downturn because of the pandemic. Let me quickly run over what the government in Australia has done so far. And this is also extraordinary to see how quickly and aggressively government policy has responded to the downturn. In the matter of really just 3 weeks, we have seen 3 increasingly enormous rescue packages put forward by the federal government. The first on March 12th, worth about 18 billion, they said. The next one on March 22nd worth 66 billion. That seemed unprecedented at the time. And then the one that was announced just on Monday of this week with the wage subsidy of $1,500 per fortnight. $130 billion is the estimated cost. I tend to think that cost is a bit high, but there's no doubt it's going to be many, many tens of billions of dollars by the time that the program is complete. We've never seen a situation where governments are forced by circumstances, even governments that would rather not be spending big money, forced by circumstances to throw everything they can at this problem. In addition to the government measures, we've also seen some big changes in the banking and credit system. The RBA has cut interest rates basically now as low as they will go. The RBA has now entered the technique of quantitative easing, where in essence they're creating money through the credit system to try and fuel spending and also provide funds to the government. And the government itself is engaging in more support for direct lending for businesses and others. So it's an unprecedented response so far. Lots of positive things in that, but lots of things that they could be doing a lot better. Let me take a couple of minutes to talk about the wage subsidy program that was announced this week in particular. Any employer of any size, business, not-for-profits, community organizations, any employer that experiences a 30% decline in its revenue compared to previous patterns, if it's a very large employer with over $1 billion revenue, it has to have a 50% decline in revenue. They can then apply to receive a wage subsidy paid by the central government to cover some or all of their workforce. And that wage subsidy is paid even if the workers can't work because their workplace has been shut down by the pandemic or there's just no business, or if they are working. Either way, the subsidy is paid by the government at a flat rate of $1,500 per fortnight for each covered worker. And the plan is that this program would last for 6 months. Hopefully that will be long enough. If necessary, they could always extend it. So there's some pros and cons of the subsidy program that was announced. On the positive side of the ledger, there's no doubt this is a very ambitious and powerful and expensive measure to try and prevent companies from having to stand down or disemploy their workforce because there's no income anymore in their business from the pandemic and the shutdown. They've cast the net fairly widely to cover most workers, including sole traders and some casual workers. And the flat rate structure of the benefit means if you're a low wage worker or a part-time worker, you're going to get a very good rate of wage replacement, even if you can't work. In fact, many part-time workers will make more money off of this than they did when they were working, which is kind of ironic. And because of this money flowing quickly to employers, it will prevent many stand downs or mass dismissals. And the goal here is to try and prevent a huge surge in unemployment. I mentioned the 2 million figure, which would overwhelm the Centrelink offices, as we've already seen, and the overall social safety net. So the goal here is to keep people in their jobs, earning money, even if they don't have anything to do. And another benefit of that is it will allow companies to start up again quickly once the health emergency is over. On the con side, there's clearly ways that this program is still reflecting, I'd say, some ideological biases of the coalition government. They would rather not be doing this, and they're forced to do it, but they're still putting a kind of a blame the victim stamp on it. They have excluded 2 large groups of workers. Anyone who's a casual worker who hasn't been with their current employer for 12 months, that's over 1 million people, will be excluded from coverage. And if you're a foreign visa worker, other than those who come from New Zealand, a foreign visa worker will not get this as well. The foreign visa workers won't qualify for Centrelink, for the job seeker benefit either. So you can see that there's a real element of racism and kind of blame the victim cutting through this. There's no reason for those 2 large groups to be excluded. The $1,500 per fortnight looks good if you're a part-time worker. It doesn't look good if you are earning a full-time wage. It's only 55% of the median full-time wage. So for a lot of people, it's going to be very hard to live off this. And then the way that it's paid to businesses without clear rules and clear protections, I think there's various ways that the design of the program needs to be strengthened to prevent employers from doing things that go against the grain or the hope of the policy. For example, you may see employers using part-time workers who they can basically hire for free because the $1,500 will cover their whole wage, and using them to replace some of their full-time workers who the employers would still have to pay a bit of their own money towards. Or the employers could cherry pick who in their own workforce is going to get this benefit and be kept on, and who do they want to let go. Other protections also needed to be put in place. In terms of thinking about the government response, my view is that we shouldn't actually even call it a stimulus. The stimulus is the usual word for government spending to try and stop a recession. But that word doesn't really apply in this case for 2 big reasons. Number one, part of the goal here is actually to shut down the economy and limit people's movement for a few weeks until hopefully the worst of the pandemic is past and we can flatten the curve, as they say. So we actually don't want people to go to work and go out shopping. The goal is to support them, to support businesses and individuals and households to last through this shutdown that we have to undertake for a while. Also, this problem, as I showed in the original graph, is way too big to imagine just it being a sort of a normal counter-cyclical smoothing process. This isn't like the normal boom and bust pattern of capitalism. This is something completely different and much worse. And the idea that you'd have a normal recovery where gradually consumers and businesses become more confident and start spending again, that is not going to solve the problem here. We are going to need something much bigger, more led by the public sector to rebuild and reconstruct the economy. In fact, I've started calling it a Marshall Plan, a COVID Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, for those who remember history, was the big plan to rebuild Western Europe after World War II, and the Americans and other governments put in swaths and swaths of public money to support investment and reconstruction and infrastructure. And it was a different political time, of course. It was motivated by fear of communism and the desire to cement American influence. But the principle of using enormous government investment to lead a process of post-war recovery is one that's still valid today. And we should be thinking of the post-pandemic recovery very much as a kind of after a war type of reconstruction. The private sector is going to be in way too bad shape to lead a normal recovery just by business investment and consumer spending. The public sector is going to have to lead. And there's lots of ways that can happen. There's lots of things that we can be doing as soon as we're able to go back to work, like rebuilding and strengthening the health system, other public infrastructure that can lead the way because private business isn't doing it. We have, of course, the whole climate dimension of it. We have to be investing tens of billions of dollars in renewable energy generation and transmission and transportation. And this is exactly going to be the time to do it because we're going to need all the investment and jobs we can get. Housing, public services, community development. Those will be the engines of growth in the recovery. And we should be preparing ourselves, even as we're, girding our loins to get through the next couple of months. We should be preparing ourselves to make the case for a democratic, publicly led reconstruction. Another thing we're going to hear a lot about, of course, is the debt and deficits. We've had the coalition government singing a single note song for 6 years that they were put on earth to balance the budget. They never did it, so they weren't actually very good at it, but it was the wrong goal anyway. Now, of course, that's out the window, and we're going to see enormous deficits, well over $100 billion this year. In the coming years, we'll probably see public debt grow towards 100% or even more of our GDP. And this isn't something to worry about. This is actually something to celebrate because it shows that the government and public agencies have the capacity to make the investments and spend the money that's required to help us get through this. Again, to use the post-World War II analogy, Australia's public debt came out of World War II with 130% of GDP, and no one was caring. Nobody said we can't fight this war because of the public debt. Far from it. So in the last few weeks, you'll notice a deadly silence from the sorts of people like the Institute for Policy Analysis and others who usually are beating the drum for austerity. They've been pretty quiet for now. But get ready. We are going to hear a call for cutbacks and debt reduction and balanced budgets as soon as the immediate health emergency is over. And we've got to resist that very strongly. It will not be a problem to finance this debt. In fact, it will be absolutely doable as long as we're using public investment to put people to work and generate incomes and rebuild our economy. The only constraint on what we can do as a society is not money. Money is created out of thin air all the time, whether it's by private banks or nowadays by the Reserve Bank. The only constraint on what we can do is people, our capacity to work and produce and do what's required. The last specific thing I want to mention is the annual wage review, which is happening right now when the Fair Work Commission reviews the minimum wage and decides how much to increase it, and then the parallel increases in wage rates in the modern awards. The submissions for this closed last week. We're already seeing employers say that we should freeze the minimum wage. In fact, one peak group came out today and said we should cut the minimum wage. That is exactly the same argument that was made in the 1930s. Business groups said the way to solve the depression is to cut wages, and that only made the depression longer and deeper. The reality is, and we show this in our submission to the Fair Work Commission, which you can see on our website, minimum wage awards have been really important. They're the only bright light in a miserable wage outlook in Australia. Without the minimum wage increases in the last few years, overall wages would be growing at less than 2%. Moreover, right now, with this shock that's hit our economy, we are already on the verge of deflation. Deflation means overall prices in the economy are falling, and a wage freeze would make that even worse. That's also what happened in the 1930s, and it's a disaster. So I think all of us and our friends in the union movement need to be pushing hard for the Fair Work Commission to go ahead with its normal increase in the minimum wage. This chart just shows the comparison. They did freeze the minimum wage for 1 year in 2009 and then had a double-sized wage increase the next year. And lots of employers are saying you should just do that again. The problem is that we're in a much more deflationary environment now than we were back in 2008, 2009. All the prices are growing much slower. In fact, at the end of last year, the broadest measure of prices, which is called the GDP deflator, was actually already falling in the last quarter, the December quarter of 2019, by 3%. So there's a huge risk of deflation that would make this recession a depression. And that would be even exacerbated by a decision to freeze the wage. Let me sum up, Ebony. What we need now Immediate economic response, we've got to first and foremost mobilize all the resources we can and put them into the response, the health response against the pandemic, including obviously healthcare facilities, testing, mobile testing, support for people at home, other measures to keep people healthy, including essential workers. We've got to do what we can to prevent companies from laying off, standing down tens of thousands of workers, and then provide income support for all those who need it. But we've also got to be preparing for a very ambitious reconstruction plan after the immediate pandemic passes, led by the public sector in terms of public investment and expanded services. We should really fix the safety net. This whole crisis has highlighted the weaknesses in our safety net. The fact that people in precarious jobs, for example, didn't qualify for income support, or the fact that the job seeker benefit, the former New Start benefit, was ridiculously low. Now the government has doubled it. It's about time they doubled it. And we can't let them cut it again once the immediate crisis is over. And then we're going to have to organize ourselves to fight back against the demands for austerity and cutbacks. There's no doubt that this is going to be a very dangerous and painful time ahead of us. And lots of dangers, including political dangers, the temptation to respond to this with authoritarianism. I'm just about 30 miles away from the US border here in Vancouver, and watching what's happening there and how Donald Trump is going to use this crisis to undermine democracy is very frightening. So we've all got to be ready to defend all the good things about our society as we can. But there's also an opportunity in this moment to make some improvements in how the society and how our economy was working anyways, by valuing and recognizing the people doing those jobs, so-called menial low-wage jobs like retail clerks and cleaners and drivers. Those are the people saving our lives right now. Instead of paying them minimum wage, we've got to value them.
Jim, I might stop you there because I think we've got a couple of questions that kind of get to some of those issues, and we've just got the questions piling up here. So are you all right to go to questions now?
Absolutely, Ebony. Sorry to go on. Sorry to bang on so long.
Not at all. That was great. And thank you so much for that, Jim. That was a really clear-eyed view of exactly what's happening. So I'll just encourage people, if you would like to ask Jim your question yourself, raise your hand so I can see you in the functions on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I'll come to you shortly. Jim, I'll just kick off with a question that we got sent beforehand. Ken Hart said that the JobKeeper payment is a great step forward, but it has a lot of gaps. And one that surprised him was the failure to provide guaranteed paid leave for COVID-19 as proposed by the ACTU back on the 11th of March. And he asked, do you think there's any chance of employer groups or the government to agree to a paid leave scheme?
I think that demand to some extent has been superseded by the other things that the government has done. They doubled the job seeker benefit and took away the waiting period. And now they've got this wage subsidy, $1,500 per fortnight. The guaranteed paid leave, the issue there was particularly casual workers who generally don't get paid leave. They were falling through the cracks, but casual workers are now covered by the increased job seeker benefit, and about half of casual workers are covered by the job keeper wage subsidy. So at this point, I think the key demand, and we've seen the ACTU moving on this in the last couple of days very strongly, is to have the job keeper benefit expanded to all casual workers and all foreign visa workers, and help those 2 million people who've been excluded from that benefit.
I'm going to come to Emma Cannon next. And Emma, are you able to talk? Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Yes.
Ask Jim your question.
Hi, Jim. How are you going?
I'm great, Emma.
I'm Emma. I'm the research director for United Workers Union, and thanks for a great presentation, Jim. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, if there is that push into the public sector, what about sectors like ECEC, which are a bit of a market mess, and what avenues do you see for nationalising essential services like that as an outcome of this sort of COVID Marshall Plan?
Oh, that's a great point, Emma. I think there's a very strong potential to link the reconstruction after this crisis to better accountability, better funding, better jobs, and better care in all caring services. You mentioned early childhood education and care. The same goes for aged care. The same goes for disability services and the NDIS. In all of those areas, the quality of work and the quality of care has been needlessly undercut because of the infatuation with privatization and market delivery systems. And now we're recognizing that apart from the unfairness of that, it's also an enormous health risk. Think of the aged care facilities or the private ones. Think of private hospitals and how unequipped and unaccountable they are around responding to the pandemic and the health dimensions of it. So I think given that we will need the public sector to lead recovery in terms of investment and growth and job creation, and we're going to need better caring services, the arguments to bringing those services back within the public realm with direct funding, never mind this market models, and improve the quality of care and jobs is going to be very strong. And I know your union will be a big part of that.
Jim, our next question is from Judith Leslie, who asks, if the employee earns less than $1,500, does the employer pocket the difference?
In theory, no. The rule is every worker who's covered by the wage subsidy under JobKeeper should get the $1,500 per fortnight, even if they were making less than that. So, I mean, on the one hand, that looks like, you know, a number of low-wage workers have just got a gift. You know, they're actually going to be making more money during the pandemic than they were before, which is a way unusual. However, I'm worried about how this is going to play out in reality. And I don't think that all employers are just going to say, here, you were only making $700 a fortnight or $800 a fortnight, take the 15. I suspect they're going to try and get something for that money. And it could involve trying to increase the hours of work by the part-timers who are getting it. It could involve substituting work by part-timers for the work of full-timers who the employer still has to pay something to. If you were making more than $1,500, the employer is still supposed to pay the extra. So some employers will try and game the system by replacing full-time workers with part-time workers. So it's a very unusual design that the government chose for this. And I think there'll be some unintended consequences. We have some information on our Twitter account about some of the risks, and we'll be posting more on our website. But I think we're going to need some rules and protections in place to make sure employers don't misuse this. But in theory, you should get the $1,500 even if you weren't earning that much before the pandemic hit.
David Fox, I'm hoping you can hear us. What's your question for Jim?
Look, it was interesting hearing about what you said about nationalising also with the public service sector as well. I'd also like to see that actually spread out to a lot of other industries. Our transport, example, of good ones, the airlines, instead of giving them massive hundreds of billions of dollars bailout, no, we buy them back. That's ours from now on, and some strong government there in the transport industry. And also big capital investment from government into other major industries such as steel and manufacturing, etc., to give us a backbone of this country against the neoliberal model of just, you know, pack up and go, send it all overseas, and we just and buy it back from there. I think that's got to be part of it. And the other one I wanted to ask you about too is actually bringing back a strong award system again, like we used to have, not like the one we've got now.
David, I think you're right on the money on every one of those points. We are going to see demands for government to bail out some major corporations through this. We've already seen it with the airlines. And we know what happens if we just give them a blank check with no strings attached. That already happened with Qantas. They got a good chunk of this fiscal relief that the government announced and then stood down 20,000 workers the very next day. Incredible arrogance by the company. So when the government is going to these lengths to help these strategic companies survive, and we need those companies to survive, it's not going to help us to just let them collapse. But the government has to have a quid pro quo. That is to say, the government has to make this aid conditional on keeping their workforce, returning the level of production to what it was before, and the government should absolutely retain an equity stake as a way of ensuring that the company acts more in the public interest in the future. So I think that you're right, and we will have to, I think, make that demand very strongly. I've already seen the demand raised by the TWU with regard to Qantas and the public equity stake in Qantas, and the same should go for other major or strategic companies and industries that are bailed out by the government. You're right on the money.
Our next question comes from Brad Sherman. He asks, what percentage of GDP do the current measures represent? He heard it was about 15%. And if so, does this mean we just bump up revenue from 24% to 40% of GDP so that Australia moves to a Scandinavian or maybe even Swiss level of taxation?
Right. Well, if you looked at those three packages that I announced, and if you took the government at face value for what they were worth, they're a little bit over $200 billion in that in cumulative spending power, if you like, which represents about 10% of Australia's GDP. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's really just in the ballpark of what other countries around the world are doing. And if anything, Australia was a little bit late coming to the pump. I think Australia was reluctant to, this government in particular, to want to spend that much because they've spent the last decade railing against Wayne Swan and the Labor government in 2009, which was very successful with its big stimulus. Now the coalition has suddenly discovered that there's a reason why you have to do those things. Now, does that mean we're going to become Scandinavia? I mean, obviously we would like to head in that direction, and that's part of my argument about the need for an expanded public sector and public investment to lead the recovery. This big outpouring of spending won't on its own do it. So the revenue side isn't really affected. In fact, revenue is going to shrink as a share of GDP. There's no doubt about that because of the recession. And in order to lift that in the long run, we'd have to undo the government's various tax cuts and start to put in place some fair taxes on corporations and high income earners and so on. But we could absolutely start to move towards Scandinavia. And I think the fact that countries with a stronger public health infrastructure, stronger public services, better information and education and communication systems are the countries that are going to survive this pandemic best. And we've already seen that with, say, some of the centralized public health interventions in places like Japan and South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, that have been very effective. And we are going to have to implement, I think, much stronger public and caring services in all areas. And then we're going to have to figure out how we pay for those. I'm not worried about how we pay for this short-term injection of funds. That's not going to be a problem. But if we want to move towards this, a system where we've got larger government, larger public services on an ongoing basis, then we're going to have to expand the revenue base to go with that. And that will be an important political challenge for us.
The next question is from Barry Trail. Are you there, Barry? Well, might not have Barry there. I don't think I've got you on mute, Barry. I might come to you in a second. I'll go back to the Q&A. The next question is from Leonie Wilbo. She heard David Littleproud claiming that the reason the government can spend such a large amount of money is because they've managed the economy so well and kept debt under control. Could you address that?
I can address it by just laughing.
Why are you laughing, Jim?
The government's debt is irrelevant to what the government can do today. So Japan's debt is 200% of GDP. That was their debt when they started, and they're spending just as much as we are. Australia's debt was 40% of GDP, and whether it was 0% or 40% or 80% makes absolutely no difference. The government has all the capacity in the world to spend what is needed right now to both address the immediate health impacts, to provide people and companies with income support to prevent unemployment and then to help those who are unemployed, and then to lead the reconstruction effort afterwards. And we've already seen that. If in fact it had anything to do with a balanced budget, how could they announce on a single day, we're going to spend $130 billion to support wage subsidies? It's going to completely blow out the budget, as it should. And what this proves is that this balanced budget obsession was false all along. We are not constrained by budgets. We're not constrained by public debt. We're only constrained by what we as human beings who live in Australia can do with our brains and our brawn and our productive capacity. And it's government's responsibility to do what's required afterwards to put that productive capacity back to work. So Mr. Littleproud's statement is back-patting nonsense. And the fact that they spent all these years obsessing on a balanced budget, never even got to one, and then, of course, threw it all out the window when this crisis hits, proves that the whole thing was just ideological nonsense.
Barry, just checking if you're there.
Someday, Ebony, I'm going to tell you what I really think.
Look forward to it. Just checking that Barry's still not there. Barry Trail? No? All right. We might mute Barry. And Kelly. Kelly Taylor. Can you hear me? Having a bit of problems with
Ebony,
going to people live. Is that Barry?
That's Paddy O'Leary. I don't know why I'm coming up as Barry Trail.
Ah. Paddy, what's your question?
So my question is, Jim, thanks for that explanation, is that I fully expect that people will, like you say, they'll say that debt is, the debt was unprecedented, the situation was unprecedented, now I've got to pay for it, now I've got to get back to normal and bring in something approaching an austerity framework to do that because of ideological reasons. I hope they don't do that, and I hope they shift during this process. But, you know, what are your thoughts on that? Because my concern is that it'll all be about how we pay for it for the next 10 years unless we can change that narrative.
Yeah. And in fact, it could take us more than 10 years because the scale of the debts that we're going to incur right now are unprecedented, certainly since World War II. So the important thing is first of all, to highlight that the government has many tools at its disposal for managing the debt that is incurred. One of them is interest rates are almost zero. In fact, interest rates relative to inflation are negative. So what that means is the Australian government can issue a 30-year bond today, and it will actually be worth less when it's paid back than it is today. In other words, the more you borrow, the more you save, literally. So that's unprecedented and is going to reduce the burden of managing that debt. Secondly, the genie is out of the bottle now in Australia, and you have the Reserve Bank engaging in quantitative easing. They're going to spend many tens of billions of dollars to buy government bonds and find other ways to pump purchasing power into the economy by creating their own money. And this is something they always could have done. And central banks in other countries have been doing it for the last decade. And we should do it. And in fact, we should use that power of public credit creation to directly finance some of the things that are going to need to occur once the pandemic is over, such as long-term public investment. I think that there will be very strong arguments to be made that this debt is manageable and shouldn't require austerity after the pandemic. And in fact, austerity will make things much worse, including the economic downturn. But ultimately, it's going to be a political battle where we're going to have to stand up as a community and say, we aren't going to tolerate the further reduction in our services and the other benefits that we get from the public sector. In fact, we need more of them. This pandemic has proved that we need more of them. And that's where preparing to make an argument for a kind of post-war rebuilding of the economy with the public sector at the center of it, I think is going to be really important to defend against the call for austerity, which you're quite right, is going to come as soon as the health emergency is over, if not before.
Jim, I'm going to try to get the next question from Kelly Taylor, and then Kay Gartner, if you're there, you'll be up next. Kelly, can you hear me? Do you have a question for Jim? No? Let's see, is Kay there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Ebony. So my question, Jim, my name is Kay Gartner. I'm a local government councillor on the south coast of New South Wales, where we all just experienced Black Summer and the devastation to our economic base from the bushfires. My question to you, and we've since faced a call from Conservative councillors to cut the rates by 25% because I guess they think businesses won't be able to pay for it. So I'm listening to you discuss the Marshall Plan style redevelopment, and I guess what you're advising is that we shouldn't be cutting rates, we should be investing rather in job creation activities. Could you help me understand that, please?
Yes, absolutely, Kay, and thank you for your service as a councillor through these incredible double-barreled crises that you've had to confront. Oh my gosh, and I guess in your part of the world, it really is rebuilding in the sense of it already being looking like a kind of a war zone because of the bushfires. And reconstruction is the only way. If you think you can go to a burned out region, especially in the wake of this pandemic, and say, well, we'll just cut taxes and that will restore the incentive to invest and business will flock here. then you really haven't learned anything from history. And that isn't going to happen at any level. It's not going to happen at a national level, a state level, or a local level. We're going to need the public sector to lead the way. And it's at the local level where those investments are closest to the ground, and where leadership like you understands best what the community needs. Now, to do that, the reality is you're going to need big help from the Commonwealth and state levels of government, because you can fight to defend the rate base, and you should, but that's not going to be enough. You're going to need big injections and transfers, and it is the Commonwealth government that has unmatched fiscal capacity, as we've seen in the last 3 weeks. So by all means, continue to hold the line and do what you can with your local resources. And then all of us have to fight to make sure that regional communities across the country are getting the resources they need from higher levels of government.
Do I have Kelly Taylor there yet?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah.
Kelly, what's your
great.
question?
Kelly, we haven't talked to you in ages. It's so good to hear you.
How are you? Thanks for accepting my question. So I work in local government and community development. So we're really seeing now how community development in its essence would be needed more than ever through this recovery. How do you see the role of local government being important in the economic, human, social recovery, rebuilding of community?
Yeah, well, that's a great follow-on from the previous question that we just had. So community development in the general sense is going to be what it's all about. And in fact, it's already happening. You know, if there's a bright light in this terrible time that we are in, it is to look at our communities and how people are very anxious and determined and enthusiastic about caring for each other and developing local systems, including checking on neighbors and delivering food to elderly people, and doing everything else that we can to help the community through this. So again, I think both economically and culturally, there's going to be more space for the sense that community matters most, that the well-being of one depends on the well-being of all. And this pandemic has reminded us of that. The most exploited, insecure Uber driver could be spreading the virus to dozens and dozens of people because we haven't created a situation where they can stay home when they're sick. And that sort of failure is intolerable now. It always was intolerable, and now we know it. So I think community development is going to be crucial. But again, as I said to Kay just before you, communities are going to need the resources to come from higher levels of government to make sure that we can do it right. But you can also mobilize opinion and mobilize the volunteer energy of people in your community to show that it can be done, and to show this is where. Not tax cuts, not handouts in hopes that some big mining company will come here and set up. Investing in us and our capacities and our communities. That's how we're going to rebuild a stronger Australia when this is all over.
Thanks, Jim. The next question is one from Leah Dwyer. She's interested to know your thoughts on why the government is still delaying on raising issues around childcare and school-aged care, and if these services are driven off a cliff, that it would have widespread implications for women's workforce participation, and that it's already too late for some centres that have forced to being closed. Do you have any response to that?
Yes, well, I mean, all of those underfunded, chronically underfunded caring and public services are in jeopardy right now. Of course, the immediate situation is complicated by the fact that some of them have to close for health reasons. On the other hand, all of our essential workforce, whether you're an ambulance driver or a healthcare worker or a retail worker, they're essential. They're going to need childcare so that they can do their jobs. So in the immediate sense, we've got to do what we can to support at least some childcare facilities to stay open. But then in the longer run, we've got to rethink how we organize this section of our economy. And that goes for the other caring services that we mentioned earlier, such as aged care and disability services. These are crucial services. The health of the whole community depends on doing it right. We've just learned that, okay, big time. And now we've got to show that we can devote the resources and the regulatory authority and the accountability to stop the disastrous marketization of those services and actually establish the first-class childcare, aged care, disability care services that Australia can afford and that Australians need. So you're absolutely right.
Rob Crosswaite, are you there?
I am indeed. Jim, there are a couple of things that are important. First one, I think we're being imposed with a demand deficit by people not being able to go out and do shopping and do their normal supply things, which will then bring off a supply deficit. I'm just wondering, given that the current government's go-to tool to solve problems is a cost-benefit analysis process, how will that play out?
Well, you're right. It's this shutdown of so much of our economy is very much unlike a traditional recession. And, I think, conventional macroeconomists have been scratching their heads. How do you make sense of it? Is it a demand shock? Well, it is, because people are losing their jobs and have no money to spend. Is it a supply shock? Well, yes, it is, because people can't go to work and production is shutting down. And I think that the nature of this problem isn't really amenable to those sort of traditional counter-cyclical tools. And this is why I stress that, first of all, the dramatic interventions that we've seen in the last 3 weeks are necessary and affordable and headed in the right direction, but they could be improved by fixing some of those problems, such as the exclusion of casual and migrant workers from the JobKeeper benefit. But it's also going to require an investment program and a reconstruction program. Do you call that a supply side measure or a demand side measure? It's both, and if you're not wedded to a sort of market-oriented vision of the world where supply and demand always cross in the middle, then you don't really care whether it's a supply shock or demand shock. What we need to do is get people back to work, producing the goods and services that we need, and it's going to take the leadership and the financial power of government to make that happen. In that sort of world, cost-benefit analysis, or the other tool that they always fall back on is tax cuts and getting rid of red tape and so on. All of those are just going to sound like they come from another planet by the time this crisis is over.
That might lead nicely into our last question, which has been upvoted by several people. Sorry, I'm just excited because I'm taking all these Zoom tools out for a drive for the first time on many occasions. So Carol's question is, isn't this a chance to reshape the economy as per Richard Dennis's Curing Affluenza book, i.e. less consumerism, more services and other things? What's your opinion about how we could reshape the economy coming out of this, Jim?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And part of Richard's brilliance is, of course, to be able to see these things before they even happen. And in fact, we're going to be living what Richard talked about with his emphasis on the need to reshape the economy. It's going to be a very different shape, partly because it has to be. There's no other section, no other segment of our society that's going to have the capacity to lead that rebuilding exercise once the war against coronavirus has been won. It's going to have to be government, and that means the government is going to use its tools all over the place, not just a little bit of pump priming and a little bit of stimulus, but direct investment in stuff that's useful and important, including infrastructure, public services, and taking a direct equity stake in lots of businesses, and just hiring people directly, not as a sort of counter-cyclical short-term make-work project, but to say, look, these are the things that we need done in our society, caring for our communities, caring for our young people, caring for our elders, and building a society that is great to live in, as opposed to the focus on minerals and exports and other traditional business activities. So there's no doubt that the economy is going to be a different shape. And we have the potential, I think, by understanding the inability of the sort of traditional business-led vision to rebuild from this crisis. We have the possibility to get ahead of the curve and say, we've got a plan. We know how this can happen, and we'll end up with an economy that's much more closely aligned with human needs than the one that we went into this crisis with. That's the optimistic part of my message.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jim, and thank you everyone online who has joined us today and for all your great questions. Thank you for bearing with our couple of little technological snafus there, but hopefully you were all able to see and hear okay. And for anyone who wasn't able to see Jim's slides right at the beginning, I know there was a few of you in that boat. We will send them around to all people who registered, along with a recording. So you'll be able to see it along with Jim's commentary as well. But we are going to wrap it up there. So thank you very much, Jim, for your time. It's great to see your face from Vancouver.
Ebony, thank you for organizing this. And I do want to correct just one mistake. You said at the beginning that we generally like to do this in a bar, but it's not possible right now. But here in Canada, it's 8 o'clock at night now, which is well past beer o'clock. We can have a virtual drink together. And this is a toast to all the people who joined the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for fighting for a better economy when we come through this.
Thank you, Jim, and cheers to you. I'll might crack one open over a late lunch perhaps and join you in that. Look, thank you again for joining us. If you are in a position to chip in a few dollars to help cover the costs of these webinars, which aren't free to host, please donate on our website at tai.org.au. Every little bit helps, especially now. And please, if you enjoyed today's webinar, join us again next week for a special presentation of the Australia Institute Centre for Responsible Technology with Peter Lewis and the Human Rights Commissioner Ed Santow. That's a joint presentation with the Guardian Australia at Home series. And again, if you sign up on our website and subscribe at tai.org.au, we'll make sure that you know how to register for that one. That's going to be at 1 p.m. next Wednesday. And again, we'll send those details out on how to register by email. So thanks again for joining us. Stay home if you can. We'll try and get to some of those other questions when we can. Keep washing your hands and stay safe. Thanks, and hopefully see you next week, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.